Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 24 through 35. And it says, Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the Jews tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. Jonathan said, My father has made trouble for our country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, Go out among the men and tell them, Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. So this Bible study is a 2-week Bible study, but it's not different really from how we usually do it because we're still taking this portion of the text for this week, and then the second portion of the text for next week, the next section that I did not yet read. But if you look at the Bible study, and you can download that at www.abqnaz.org/alive. I put it all in one Bible study. And the reason is because it's all one story. And honestly, I set out to write one Bible study on this whole text further down into the chapter. But there's just a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to break down and try to figure out what God is saying to us. And so I didn't feel like we could fit everything that we needed to talk about into 1 week. But then I thought, well, then I just need to separate it out and talk about the second part of the story next week. And we'll do it in a different Bible study like we normally do, except for I said, man, this is all the same story. And I want it all to be connected. And so anyway, so when you download this, there's 2 pages. It'll be, if you print it front and back or whatever, but it'll show up as 2 pages. We're only doing the first page this week, and then next week we're going to do the second page, but it's a continuation of the same story. And so I just kind of included it in one document, which is a little bit unusual for the way that we do things. It's not the first time it's ever happened, but it's a little unusual. So I just want you to be aware. So number 1 in our study for today says, what happened in last week's study? A, raiding parties were going out from the Philistine camps. That's true. B, the Hebrews had no weapons, so they had to turn their farm implements into weapons. Yes, that's true. And C, Jonathan and his armor bearer crossed enemy lines and started something, and they routed the Philistines. God saved Israel, and Israel advanced forward toward victory. And that's a big summary, I think, of what was a difficult text that we talked about last week. But I think the important part really is that it ended on a high note, that it ended with them advancing forward and pushing back the enemy lines, and just really seemed like a real positive thing. And that's important because number two is going to get us into how we start this text, which is very different from what we would expect to hear. So number two says, what do we learn in verse 24 about the joy of Israel's victory? So verse 24 says, now the Israelites were in distress that day. So rather than being triumphant and victorious and excited, they were instead in distress, and we're going to talk about why. So it doesn't seem like it was there. And B, Israel was distressed instead of joyous. So that's what we learn. And then number three says, why, according to verse to 14:24, were the Israelites in distress? And the second part of 24 says, because Saul had bound the people under oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. So basically, they're victorious. They're pushing the Philistines back, but Saul is saying the battle's not over. We are going to finish this. So don't stop and eat. Don't have a big party and celebrate victory. We're going to keep pushing forward because we're going to win this thing tonight. And so he says, you're not going to eat. We're not going to. And in reading the commentaries, there was some mixed feelings about this, and I think that's kind of a theme in these kind of weeks of Bible studies. Some said, well, Saul, this was basically a fast, and it was a spiritual thing, and they're going to battle and they're going to win this war, and so Saul is calling them to a spiritual fast. We're going to not take on our own pleasure or sustenance. Instead, we're going to hold out until God brings us full victory. And so that would be the positive side of it. And now, of course, when I read it and I hear, before I have avenged myself on my enemies, it occurs to me that Saul is a leader who is focused more on his victory right now than on the people that he serves. And that it is really easy for a leader to get wrapped up in their own goals and their own purposes and forget that any leader serves the people that they lead. And so right now, in that text, in that verse, it doesn't sound like Saul is serving the people of Israel and serving his army. It sounds like he is using an army as a means to his end, which is unfortunately a really common problem in leadership. It's like a common situation. So now a lot of that is just reading into what Saul says that sounds a little off to me, and it's very possible that maybe I'm off base here. Maybe that's just the way the writer wrote it down, and it's the way kings talked, and maybe he was not that way. But it really seems like, the army is in distress. They're winning, but they're in distress instead of victorious. So we just see this challenge, and it creates some dissonance and some trouble here that kind of creates a problem for Saul too. And that's what we're going to keep reading on into here. Number 4 says, what happened in 14:25 through 28? Well, they went into the woods. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. That is my favorite woods ever. I've never walked into a woods and found just honey everywhere. Now, I would say that maybe if I did do that, I might think there are bees, and that may not be as exciting as I thought it was. Um, but there's honey on the ground. B, no one touched the honey because they feared the oath that Saul had bound them under. So it almost sounds like there was so much honey on the ground that it says they didn't touch their hand to their mouth, which sounds like they probably got it on them because it's all over the place here. And so they almost had to purpose not to, especially if they were starving, and this is sugar and sustenance, and they have to intentionally not touch their hand to their mouth. Now, Jonathan, on the other hand, Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know if the oath came while he was out, missing from camp and nobody knew he was, so he didn't get the message, or what happened here. Or if he just didn't pay attention to anything his father said, which is a son kind of thing to do. But he had not heard this, so it seems that he is the only one in the entire army that had not heard this, that they all know, is why when he did what he did, their eyes got this big around, and they're like, hey, and then they're a little jealous because they're like, hey, I mean, okay, he's the king's son. I guess he can do whatever he wants, but we can't eat. And so there was a real big problem that was here, because D, Jonathan ate the honey. E, one of the soldiers told Jonathan about the oath, and F, one of the soldiers told Jonathan, that is why the men are faint. Like, hey, if you didn't know why that your dad had caused us to make this oath, at least didn't you look around and notice that everybody else is starving to death and nobody else is touching their hands to their mouth with this honey, and we're all like falling out because we're so hungry. Like, you pay attention what's going on around you, or do you not? But at least they told him. I mean, there's some amount of respect they must have had for Jonathan to be willing to tell him and not just grumble and complain about him behind his back like most people do. But then number 5 says, how did Jonathan respond, according to verses 29 through 30? So instead of saying, oh man, I did this wrong, I shouldn't have done this, he says, my father has made trouble for the people. In other words, he says, it would be right for us to eat this. What my father has done is wrong. He shouldn't have done it this way. Now, let me just say that I tend to agree with them. But one of the challenges that I've found is that your father's the king. He's the leader appointed by God. And so it doesn't matter if you agree with that or not. It's probably a bad thing to say in front of the soldiers. And I know that this is something we wrestle with when, I'm the pastor. And so I imagine there are people that feel the same way on the staff or on the leadership team, that sometimes I do things and they say, oh, what is he doing? That's not the way we should do it. This is causing problems. This is what he's done. Now, we all tend to feel that way about our leaders. Just ask anybody how they think the president's doing, and you'll find out that a lot of people second guess decisions that leaders make. However, even if you feel that way, it's not good to say that in front of especially if you have influence, and you say that in front of a bunch of people to undermine the leader. That a lot of us, I think, are careless with our words. And I think Jonathan here was careless with his words. and he may have been right, but I see trouble all over this. He may have been right, but it doesn't matter. Saul is the leader, and David's response. The last time that we studied this First Samuel, one of the things that we did was handed out to all the leaders the book called A Tale of Three Kings, and it talks about the difference between Saul's leadership and David's leadership and Absalom. And these are the three kings. And one of the things that we find out about David is that even though he was being pursued by Saul, he didn't lay a hand on God's anointed. And even when he cut off the corner of his robe to show that he could have, he repented. And when we look at the way David responded to Saul, even when, I mean, he had every legitimate right. He was the anointed king, and Saul was trying to kill him. You would really think if anybody had a right to take the kingship or to say something that would discredit the leader, it was David, but he didn't. Whereas Absalom, standing at the gates of the city, said, if I was king, then this is what I would do. It's too bad my father David doesn't have any time to hear the problems and judge between you. I can hear, and if I was king, that wouldn't happen. And we see that Absalom undermined his father's authority and ultimately took over the kingdom for a short time, but that didn't go very well for him in the long run. And so, man, Jonathan here, mostly Jonathan is the hero of the story. Mostly Jonathan is doing things that are respectable. We have noticed some tendency towards impulsiveness, perhaps, but mostly Jonathan is the hero in these stories. And right here, he does something that it's hard. And man, he was probably right, but it is hard to see him as the hero when he undermines the authority of his father, who is the anointed of God, who was picked as king. Even though we know that he's been rejected and somebody else is going to be named, nonetheless, David didn't see that as an excuse or opportunity to go ahead and discredit Saul. Number 6, what happened in verses 31 through 35. A, they struck down the Philistines and they were exhausted. B, they pounced on the plunder, butchered the animals, and ate them. That should be and ate them right there on the ground, blood and all. C, Saul intervened and had a stone brought in order for the men to butcher the animals. So yeah. So when they finally did have victory and finish the battle, then evening was coming and they were allowed to eat. And now they're famished, they're starving, and they pounced on these animals and started to kill them right there on the ground, just where they lay, and just eat them, blood and all, it says. And number 7 says, why was what the men were doing a problem? And it refers also, see Leviticus 17, 13, and 14. So I'm going to read that to you. In Leviticus, it says, any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who hunts any animal or bird that may be eaten must drain out the blood and cover it with earth, because the life of every creature is its blood. That is why I have said to the Israelites, you must not eat the blood of any creature, because the life of every creature is its blood. Anyone who eats it must be cut off. Now, in modern days, we understand that a lot of those laws had to do with bloodborne pathogens, things that could be caught from the blood and transmitted. and so you did that in order to make the meat safe. Um, and God's law and God's commands in many ways are for us to remain safe. And here they are so hungry that they are throwing off restraint, and they're throwing off everything that would have been their normal custom, because and you could argue that Saul caused this, but this was not the will of God. This was not God's command. They were doing it wrong. And number 8 says, why did the soldiers do this? A, they didn't care about God or his law, which is not in the context of the story what seems to be the case. B, they were hungry. This was really all Saul's fault. So we go back to Jonathan's statement about causing trouble for the Israelites. He's put them in a position of temptation as well. This is really all Saul's fault. Or C, I think that Jonathan's rebellious attitude started this all. Is it possible that what Jonathan said is rubbing off on them, and now they're just, they feel like they have an excuse, and they can do things that are against what is supposed to be done, because obviously Jonathan doesn't care about what's supposed to be done. He does whatever he wants. So we can blame Jonathan. Or D, does it matter? They were doing something they shouldn't, and they will be held accountable. So let's just say this. We can second guess Saul and we can second guess Jonathan, but in the end, the men who are doing this are going to be held accountable for their own actions. And they don't have an excuse to do something wrong because of Saul or because of Jonathan. And so I think that's an important thing. We can get wrapped up in why we do things, and I think we do that. We make justifications a lot why we did the wrong thing, and excuses. We start that when we're kids, when our parents are upset with us for doing something wrong, and we try to explain to them why we did it. But it doesn't matter. It was wrong. We had the choice. Number 9 says, how does Saul respond? Now, this is interesting. And I would say that this part, no matter what you think about the decision he made before in his leadership, the decision he makes now is pretty impressive leadership in my book. He says, A, he struck everyone down who had been doing this. B, he allowed them to continue since they were obviously hungry, so it justified their disregard for God's law. So those are like opposite answers, right? And a lot of times, I think in leadership or in our own decision making, we think those are our only two answers. But C is what Saul did. He had a large stone rolled over so that they could slaughter the animals properly and drain the blood. So the idea is, up off the ground, you slaughter it, the blood drains down and away from the animal, so it drains out of the animal and it gets down on the ground where you can cover it with dirt, as Leviticus says. But the animal is up off of that, so it doesn't just sit there in the animal. And so Saul's response was not to punish the men or to justify them or allow them to go on doing the wrong thing, but rather to provide for them to be able to do the tools that they need to empower them to do the right thing. And I would just say that in leadership, a lot of times we have this tendency to think that it's all black and white, and we either need to, let them go or we need to punish them. And maybe the answer is we need to step in and empower them. And I think there's not enough leaders that see their role and their job as the person who empowers the people to do what they can do, what they should do, what ultimately is right. We would rather sit as judges than as resources. to provide for people to do what is right. So number 10, this is an interesting leadership case study. We are not told within the text what God thought of any of these decisions or behaviors, what God thought of Saul, what God thought of Jonathan, what God thought of the men. This definitely seems like a dysfunctional situation. Was Saul right to put the people under oath? Maybe. I mean, if his desire was that they focus on God, if his desire and his heart was that they fast so that God would have his way in the situation, then absolutely he was right. If his desire was to keep them hungry until they won the battle and to hold control over them, maybe not. Maybe Jonathan was right. He did make trouble for the people. What do we think of Jonathan's response to Saul's oath, man? You can think that in your head. Maybe that's true, but man, it is divisive and dysfunctional to say it out loud. And you can say what you want about the need for other voices in maybe the political spectrum or something like that, and you may be right that we need to have civil disagreement and be able to stand and say things that disagree with the status quo. And we don't need a bunch of yes men. And you're probably right. You're right about all that. But I would say that there's a place and a time for that, and the place and the time is usually not in front of everybody who you have influence over. So, for instance, I've had this discussion. Pastor Bain taught me this. I've had this discussion with Dr. Lasher, that in a lot of board type meetings, whether it's our local church board or a district board or whatever, we can have disagreements. There can be people that think differently on an issue, but in the end, when the board makes the decision and the board comes out of that room, the board has made the decision. And we should not be saying, well, yeah, this is what the board said, but I didn't agree with that. We should be very careful about that. And especially if we have influence and we cause division. So I think it's in Titus, it tells us to warn a divisive person, and then after that don't have anything to do with them. So if there's somebody that's bringing division in the church, I think that we have some clear instructions on how to deal with that, and that is not what God wants. And it's the divisive person that's wrong. There was a situation between staff members, and when Fred was here, my co-pastor, there was a situation of disagreement. And somebody came to me, actually wrote a letter to me to complain about Fred and something that he was doing, which I ultimately threw away and didn't even respond to. And later on, that person said, Pastor Pete, it really hurt me that you didn't respond. And I said, well, it may be that Fred could have handled these things differently, or that he even today might look back on them and handle them differently. It may be that he was wrong. I don't know. May not be. But in the end, I said, I read this letter and I knew that you were wrong. So even if the leader was wrong, the way you're handling it to bring division and try to divide me from my co-pastor was definitely wrong. And so I said, there was reconciliation and there was forgiveness and there was all sorts of things, but in that moment, it was just, I knew that what was going on here was divisive, and that is wrong. And so it's one thing, it's okay to disagree. Like, I don't get upset with people that disagree with me. I do get upset with people who won't talk to me about their disagreement and go to person after person under their influence to divide them from me rather than to come to agreement on things together. That's just the wrong answer. And it really, I mean, it doesn't say that Jonathan like actively and intentionally built a team to try to divide here, but the fact that he said it was a beginning of a division there, and I don't feel really good about that. And then the last thing, how do we feel about Saul's response to the men's breaking of God's law? I really think that was the best thing that could have been done. I mean, he could have punished the people, and rightfully so, probably. And they might have said, "But you're the one that did this to us," and they may have been right. And as a leader, sometimes, we got to recognize our place in the whole thing and be able to say, instead of punishing, I'm not going to let this thing go, but instead of punishing, I'm going to try to lift up and empower. Number 11 says, what do you think God would have you do in a situation like this? Well, situations are difficult and varied, and it's hard to say, but I think we can learn some things about leadership through this, and how we might handle situations like this in our future, whether we're in Saul's position or Jonathan's, or Saul in the second piece of this leadership case study. Anyway, I hope that we can always learn and grow from the scripture. This has been an interesting text. We're not done with this story. We're going to continue on with this next week, finishing the lower part of this Bible study, the second page of this Bible study. But I would say that this is an interesting section of scripture that doesn't have a lot of firm explanation of who's the hero and who's the villain, if you will. Who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. And in a lot of places in scripture, we have it much clearly defined for us. And I think it's healthy for us to wrestle with this a little bit. And knowing what we know about the characters, we know that none of them seem to always be right or always be wrong, that God was working in them and using them, and then sometimes they were doing things on their own too. And so we can learn from this.